before we read the psalm this evening, I just want to say that one of the things that there seems to be a lot of confusion about is many people think that as Christians we shouldn't have burdens. In many respects, that's been the way in which the gospel has been preached. If you've got a problem, come to Christ and he will solve the problem for you. Come and lay your burden upon Christ, and whatever that burden is, he will take it away. And so, as Christians, we should have no burdens whatsoever. As those who are pious, as those who are righteous, we should have no burdens at all. David was a man who was considered righteous before God. He was a man with a heart after God. He was probably, some people have described him, even this past week I saw somebody describing David as the most godly man in the Bible. I disagree, because the most godly man in the Bible was Jesus Christ, but David certainly was a godly man, and yet he was a man who was a saint, but a saint with a burden, and we're going to look at that burden this evening. In fact, David had many burdens, and many of the Psalms are all about David addressing those burdens. And so, yes, while we can sing with confidence that burdens are lifted at Calvary, while we can read Pilgrim's Progress and see Christians' burden being lifted at the cross, and certainly the burden of sin is removed, the truth is, the fact of the matter is that we as Christians very often live our lives with many, many burdens. One thinks of Paul, the Apostle Paul, for instance, and the thorn in the flesh. He cried out to the Lord 3 times to take that thorn from him, but the Lord didn't take it from him. In fact, all the Lord said to him was, "My grace is sufficient for you," and pointed him back to his grace. And as you start to scratch, not only in the scriptures, but certainly in the scriptures, you start to scratch, you'll find that there are many godly people who have many burdens to bear, David just being one of them. If you start to scratch amongst Christians and start to speak to Christians, you will find that many of them are bearing great burdens. In fact, I'd go as far as to say every one of them, in one way or another, is bearing one burden or another. So here is David, a saint with a burden, and I just want us to analyze that this evening. And that's the value of the Psalms, is the Psalms help us not only to think biblically, because all the rest of Scripture is God revealing His truth to us. The Psalms is man's response to God and to that truth. So the Psalms don't only help us to think biblically, but the Psalms help us to feel biblically. And David is coming as a man who's feeling deeply at this time because of the burden that he is bearing. And then in the third place, the Psalms help us to react biblically to the true life situations that we face. And the Psalms are brutally honest with the kinds of burdens that we face and the kinds of life situations that we find ourselves in. And so I trust that we will be able to think and to feel and to react biblically as we consider the way David does. This is a lament psalm, and we've spoken about the laments, and David is coming with his lament to God, which is what we should do. And as we analyze David dealing with this burden of his, I trust that we will learn that too. Just let me once again just say to you, all the lament psalms, lamentations, all of the laments that the book of Job, what you will find in common in them is this. here are people who are facing burdens, and what do they do with those burdens? They're facing burdens, and as I said when we were dealing with how learning to lament, when you are going through those deep waters and rough times in your life, and you just don't have any answers, you've got the options of, what do I do with this? I got to ask the question in that situation. Number one, does God exist? Because so many people will say, well, where's God if these kinds of things happen to you? What kind of God is it? Where is God? There is no God when these things happen. So you've got to ask that question, does God exist? And if you answer that question biblically and correctly, yes, there is a God, you've got to ask then a second question, and that is, well, is God actually in control of everything? Is he actually sovereign? Because why would he allow these things to happen? Or is there some other force that is actually at work as well, which sometimes can undermine him, which sometimes can have victory over him, and so we're going through these rough periods because at that point in time Satan's got the upper hand. And when Clifford was killed, that's what somebody said to me. Oh, well, this wasn't of the Lord. This is Satan had the upper hand at that moment in time. Rubbish. Absolute nonsense. God is sovereign. He's in control of every single thing. And when you look at those circumstances, when I looked at those circumstances, I said this could not have happened in any way by accident. This was the hand of God at work at that moment. So you come to answer that second question correctly. Yes, God is sovereign. He exists, and he is sovereign. He is in control of everything, even the sparrows falling to the ground, as I said this morning. So then you've got a third question to ask, and that is, well, is God good? Because if he allows these kinds of things to happen, is he good? And many people have complained about that. In fact, some of the most prominent so-called atheists, it's not so much that they don't like the idea that God exists. What they don't like is the idea that the God of the Bible exists. And they look at the Bible and they say, what kind of a God is this? We don't like what we read there about this God. So now you've answered those three questions correctly. Yes, God exists. Yes, he is sovereign and in control. And yes, he is good. He's working all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Well, then how do I deal with this issue that I'm sitting with in my life right now, where I seem to find no way out? What am I going to do? Well, what many in the world do is they cry, and that's what lamenting is, it's crying. But in their crying, they run away from the Lord. To cry is human, that's what humans do. But to lament is Christian. And we cry, but we don't run from God, we run to God. And so here is David, and he's running to God, and we'll look at that in a moment. So the first thing that you do in lament is you turn to God, and David's turning to God. The second thing that you do is you complain to God. You are honest with God. You tell God, this is the situation. Like Job, I don't like it, I don't understand it, but I'll yet praise you because you deserve to be praised. But take your complaint to God. Where else are you going to take it? If he is in control, he's sovereign, and if he is good, where else are you going to take that complaint? So you complain to God, cry to God. But then, in the fourth place, to trust God. And we find David trusting God. Look at Psalm 55, and I'll give you a couple of verses before we read the whole psalm. Psalm 55, verse 9, David, Lord, confuse and confound their speech, for I see violence and strife in the city. He trusts the Lord to do this. Verse 16, we see David again trusting the Lord. But I call to God, and the Lord will save me. Verse 18, though many are against me, he will redeem me from my battle unharmed. Verse 19, God, the one enthroned from long ago, will hear and will humiliate them, because they do not change and do not fear God. Here is David. He believes in the existence of God. He believes in the goodness of God. And he believes in the sovereignty of God. The God, the one enthroned from long ago, will hear. And so, let us come to the psalm this evening, and we will then analyze it and consider some of the aspects. We're not going to go through the psalm verse by verse, and I'll tell you why in a moment. It's not one of those psalms that you can do that with, and I think for good reason. So Psalm 55, for the choir director with stringed instruments, a maskil of David. God, listen to my prayer and do not hide from my plea for help. Pay attention to me and answer me. I am restless and in turmoil with my complaint because of the enemy's words, because of the pressure of the wicked. For they bring down disaster on me and harass me in anger. My heart shudders within me. Terrors of death sweep over me. Fear and trembling grip me. Horror has overwhelmed me. I said, if only I had wings like a dove, I would fly away and find rest. How far away would I flee? I would stay in the wilderness. I would hurry to my shelter from the raging wind of the storm. Lord, confuse and confound their speech, for I see violence and strife in the city. Day and night they make the rounds on its walls. Crime and trouble are within it. Destruction is inside it. Oppression and deceit never leave its marketplace. Now it is not an enemy who insults me, otherwise I could bear it. It is not a foe who rises up against me, otherwise I could hide from him. But it is you, a man who is my peer, my companion, and good friend. We used to have close fellowship. We walked with the crowd into the house of God. Let death take them by surprise. Let them go down to Sheol alive, because evil is in their homes and within them. But I call to God, and the Lord will save me. I complain and groan morning, noon, and night, and he hears my voice. Though many are against me, he will redeem me from my battle unharmed. God, the one enthroned from long ago, will hear and will humiliate them, because they do not change and do not fear God. My friend acts violently against those at peace with him. He violates his covenant. His buttery words are smooth, but war is in his heart. His words are softer than oil, but they are drawn swords. Cast your burdens on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never allow the righteous to be shaken. God, you will bring them down to the pit of destruction. Men of bloodshed and treachery will not live out half their days, but I will trust in you. So as we come to this psalm this evening, first of all, let's just consider this saint with a burden, this David, the saint with a burden. Let us consider his situation. What is the situation that gives rise to the psalm? What is this war that he finds himself in? Well, last week we found David in Psalm 54. He was running away from Saul, and he was being hounded like a dog. He had been betrayed by Keilah, even after having saved and defending them, and he had been betrayed by the Ziphites. And so all around him he found these enemies that were coming against him. But now, what is the situation? Well, most commentators are in agreement and saying that the situation here that David is describing is actually the situation where Absalom was basically organizing a coup d'etat against David. His own son was rising up against him and undermining his authority and wanting to usurp the kingdom from him. And so it was a time of warfare where David flees because of what is happening at the hand of his son Absalom. And so you find that the language that is being used here is a language of warfare. And that's very clear. If you look at verse 3, where he says about this warfare, he says, because of the enemy's words, because of the pressure of the wicked. These are an enemy that he is facing. It's a war that he is going into. Verses 9 through to 14, over and over again, it speaks of warfare. Lord, confuse and confound their speech, for I see violence and strife in the city. Day and night they make the rounds on its walls. Crime and trouble are within it. Destruction is inside it. Oppression and deceit never leave its marketplace. As you look at the situation in the Middle East at the moment, and you look at those cities, and you look at Beirut, the destruction in the city, that's what David is speaking about here. Verse 12, now it is not an enemy who insults me, otherwise I could bear it. It is not a foe who rises up against me, otherwise I could hide from him. But it is you, a man who is my peer, my companion, and good friend. It's a warfare in which it's a civil war. It is those who you would expect to be on your side that are coming against you. And so David sees this as a warfare. Verse 18, though many are against me, he will redeem me from my battle unharmed. It's warfare. Verse 20, my friend acts violently against those at peace with him. He violates his covenant. Verse 21, buttery words are smooth, but war is in his heart. His words are softer than oil, but they are drawn swords. It's war. David is at war, and at this point in time, it is particularly grievous because it is from within his own household. He says here, it is not an enemy who insults me, otherwise I could bear it. It is not a foe who rises up against me, otherwise I could hide from him. But it is you, a man who is my peer. He could be saying here, it is a man who is my son, who is the flesh of my flesh. This is my own home, my peer. He is my companion and a good friend. A father and a son very often are good friends. Some fathers will say of their sons, he is my best friend. And David, he's a companion, he's a good friend. We used to have close fellowship. We walked with the crowd into the house of God. We've worshipped together as a family. But here we are now in the situation where you are attacking me. And I want to say to you how often that's where the attacks come from. How often. And that's when it really becomes unbearable, when the attacks come from those who are closest to us. It's really unbearable then. My mother always used to say, the only people who can hurt you are the people who you love. Those are the ones who can really hurt you. And it's true, because so often when our enemies come against us, we expect it of them and know better. But when those who are close to us turn on us, it is particularly painful. And so here is David under this threat. In fact, he's under the threat of death. Look at verse 4. My heart shudders within me. Terrors of death sweep over me. He knows that his life is in actual danger here. It is betrayal. That's what verses 12 to 14 are. It's a betrayal against him. Verses 20 and 21. My friend acts violently against those at peace with him. He violates his covenant. His buttery words are smooth, but war is in his heart. His words are softer than oil, but they are drawn swords. The biggest problem with adultery is not the physical sexual act. The biggest problem is the betrayal, the breaking of the covenant. In fact, the word for adultery in the scriptures is really the word for breaking of the covenant. When God says to Israel, you are an adulterous nation, he's not actually accusing them of physical sexual adultery. He's saying, you've broken the covenant with me. And so that is really the betrayal that is really most hurtful in that kind of situation. The person who should be closest to you, the place where you should find your refuge, the place where you should find your safety. A man's home is his castle. That's where you should feel safe. That's where you should have all of the support against your enemies. But here you are, you flee into your place of safety, you flee into your den, and what do you find? You find it's a den of robbers. You find that it's those who have turned against you, and that is particularly painful. And so David is here under that threat of death, and it's the hardest to bear. It's the most painful. And I put it to you, it's a common problem even within the churches. How often pastors have found themselves betrayed by those that they have trusted. How often congregations have found themselves betrayed by the pastors that they trusted. And of course there's a famous situation like that right now. And so David was facing this. You go through the scriptures, the prophets faced it. David faced it. Jesus faced it. Today's hosannas turn into tomorrow's crucifies. How often that happens. And how does that make him feel? This is the fact. This is the situation. This is where he is. How does that make him feel? What kind of frame of mind does it leave him in? So let us look then at his frame of mind because of the situation. And I say to you, this is why I found it impossible to say, okay, well, let's take this psalm and work through it verse by verse. Because if you try to draw a structure to the psalm, so easy. So often it's easy to find a structure in the psalm, and it's then therefore easy to find a structure for a sermon when you're preaching that psalm, because the psalm itself gives you the structure, it gives you the points. But here's a psalm which, quite frankly, the structure is all over the place. It's like it's been put into the tumble dryer, and everything's just been thrown around left, right, and center. And so if you try and follow the structure of this psalm, I put it to you that you would have to come up with a 10-point sermon. But what a confusing 10-point sermon it would be. Because your first point would be David running to God, verses 1 and 2. Okay, this is great. We've got a place, a starting place. He's turning to God, and that is great. We see the second point would be him running from his enemies. The second part of verse 2 down to verse 5. He's now running from his enemies. And in fact, one of the enemies that you find David running from here is not just the external enemy, it's the enemy from within. Because here he is, a person who believes he's under God's protection, and yet he's in this danger. And what happens is the accuser comes along and says, so you thought you had it all together. You thought you knew God. You thought God was on your side. But look at this. You're abandoned by him. What happens to us when we're in that kind of situation? We actually start accusing ourselves. We actually start having a war within ourselves. And so here is David. If you look at what is going on here, he says, verse 3, because of the enemy's words, because of the pressure of the wicked, for they bring down disaster on me and harass me in anger. Look at verse 4. My heart shudders within me. Terrors of death sweep over me. Fear and trembling grip me. Horror has overwhelmed me. I said, if only I had the wings of a dove. So David is basically, here he's running from his own shadow. He's running from the internal conflict that is there. So the second point would be him running from his enemies, including the enemy from within. The third point would be verses 6 to 8, where basically he's running from everything, particularly godless people that he is running from. And so he's wanting to run, but where can he run? He doesn't even know. He'd love to fly away from them, but he can't do that. He doesn't have the wings of a dove. And so what you have here is we have David feeling helpless and hopeless and useless. Verse 6, I said, if only I had the wings of a dove, I would fly away and find rest. But he knows that's just wishful thinking. And so David is in absolute turmoil here. So what does he then do? Well, he does the best thing. Verse 9, he flees to the Lord again. So you can see he's fleeing to the Lord, he's fleeing away from his enemies. He's fleeing from himself, he's fleeing to the Lord. Verse 9, Lord, confuse and confound their speech, for I see violence and strife in the city. And that's great. But verses 10 and 11, he still lives in doubt and suspicion of everyone. And you can align this with verse 3. So verses 10 and 11, day and night they make the rounds on its walls. Crime and trouble are within it. Destruction is inside it. Oppression and deceit never leave its marketplace. As I say, verse 3, because of the enemy's words, because of the pressure of the wicked, for they bring down disaster on me and harass me in anger. So David is there and he's there and he's there again, all over the place. He's depressed. That would be the sixth point in this psalm, is that he is depressed in verse 12. Now, it's not my enemy who insults me, otherwise I could bear it. All the way through to verse 15, it is speaking of depression, the inner turmoil that he is facing. His mental health is under stress in this particular instance. And now, as I say, it's even from within his own home, and how much more disastrous is that. But verses 16 and 19, again, we have David now trusting in the Lord. So, but I call to the Lord, and the Lord will save me. I complain and groan morning and noon and night, and he hears my voice. This is sounding good. This is sounding good and faithful. Though many are against me, he will redeem me from my battle unharmed. God, the one enthroned from long ago, will hear and humiliate them because they do not change and do not fear God. So here he is, resting in God, but no sooner has he done that than we suddenly find him again in verses 20 and 21, still fearing his friends, still fearing his enemies, still fearing his son. So what does David do? Well, that would be the ninth point if we were taking the psalm in terms of instruction. What does he do? Well, he counsels himself. And I want to say to you that verse 22 is the highlight of the psalm. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never allow the righteous to be shaken. And so what a wonderful place for him to be in counseling himself. And then the 10th point would be verse 23, where David again is trusting in the Lord. So the point is, his frame of mind is like a scrambled egg. That's really what it's like. And how often when we're in those difficult times are we exactly like that? The emotions are up there, they're down there. We're looking for hope there, and then we're looking for hope here. We're all over the place. And no sooner have we comforted ourselves in the hope of God here, than something else happens there. And it's like trying to take jelly and nail it to a tree. It just won't stay. It's falling all over the place. And that's exactly where David is. And as I say, the Psalms are great in terms of not only helping us to think correctly, but helping us to deal with our feelings correctly and to be honest with our feelings. So, as I say, verse 22 is the high point of the psalm because David counsels himself. He biblically counsels himself. So in the third place, look at David's counsel as we see it here, particularly in verse 22. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never allow the righteous to be shaken. I said that people say that as Christians we shouldn't be burdened. And in many respects, yes, that's true. And David casts his burden on the Lord, and he's doing exactly the right thing. And so, what does he do? He counsels himself to cast his burden on the Lord. What do you do when you can't run away? What do you do when you can't run away from yourself? David says, I would like to flee away. I'd like to fly away. There are many times when we're in a situation and we feel, I'd love to run 1,000,000 miles away from the situation, but you can't. And very often you can't because, like David, that would mean running away from yourself, because actually a lot of the burden is within yourself. So what does he do? He casts his burden on the Lord. And basically verse 22 you can take as a parallel verse to 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. Cast your burdens on the Lord because he cares for you. And I want to say to you, that's a very simple thing to say. Cast your cares on the Lord. Cast your burdens on the Lord because he cares for you. But it's not an easy thing to do. In fact, that word to cast your burdens on the Lord is a word which is only used in one other place in the scriptures. And it is used of, it is the word that you would use of a shot puttist, putting the shot. It's cast it, it's heave it, it's a heavy burden. I say it's only in one other place. No, it's not just in one other place in the scriptures. It is found in Luke chapter 17 and verse 2, where it says, troubles will come in this world, but woe to the one through who they come. It would be better for him that a millstone be tied around his neck and he be thrown into the ocean. He be cast into the ocean. How do you cast somebody into the ocean who's got a millstone tied around their neck? You don't just pick it up and do that. It's not just a little tossing. It's not just a little cast. To pick up one of those millstones, that's heavy, and it's heavy work to cast it and throw it on the Lord. It's also used in Acts chapter 27, where Paul is being shipwrecked on the way to being shipwrecked at Malta. In Acts 27 verse 19, when they realize they are in this desperate danger, they take up the ship's tackle and they throw it into the sea. Now, if you know anything about sailing, and particularly with those old ships, to take a ship's tackle is not a light task. You are throwing heavy stuff into the sea there. It's a big burden that you're picking up and you're throwing it over. In verse 29, it's describing them throwing the anchors, picking up the anchors and throwing the anchors overboard. Have you ever tried to pick up an anchor? They don't pick up that easy. Let me tell you, they're not that light. So that's a heavy burden to cast upon the Lord. It takes a lot of effort because it's a heavy burden that you've got to lift and you've got to cast it onto him. The word literally means cast onto him. So what David does is he casts his cares onto the Lord. Basically, he now trusts God to sustain him. He trusts God to keep him and stop him from falling. To do that, beloved, is not easy. And the reason it's not easy is, do you really trust the one that you're casting your burden on? You see, so often we come to cast our cares on the Lord, but we think, okay, I'll give it to the Lord, but hold on, I can do it. I'll give it to the Lord, but hold on, I've got a better way. You keep on wanting to rely on yourself. No, you've got to cast that burden onto the Lord and leave it there with Him. And that is hard. But praise God, He is the burden-bearing God. I want to say to you that sometimes people have taken 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13, saying, no, God will not allow you to be, won't try you beyond what you can bear. That's a misunderstanding or a mistranslation of the word there. The word there should be translated tempt. And in the context, you can see it should be translated tempt. He won't tempt you beyond what you can bear, but will always then provide a way out for you. Because He does, and He did burden Paul beyond what they could bear. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 8 and 9, we were burdened beyond what we can bear, even to the point of death. That we felt this was going to kill us. And so the point is this: the only place that you can then go with that burden that you can't bear is go to the one who can bear it. In fact, the one who has borne the greatest burden that you bear, and He's borne it on the cross. Let me tell you, there's one burden that you cannot bear yourself, and that is the burden of your sins. And so here is David, when his friends accuse him, and like you and I, when the accuser comes and accuses us, what we've got to do is take those burdens and cast them on the Lord. And yes, He removes the burden of sin at Calvary. And that's what David is saying here. Cast your burdens on the Lord and He will sustain you and will never allow the righteous to be shaken. The only way we can be the righteous is if He declares us righteous. David goes on and says, God, you will bring them down to the pit of destruction. Men of bloodshed and treachery will not live out half their days, but I will trust in you. I will live out my days. I will live out all the days that you've given to me. I will live for all eternity because you are carrying that burden of my sin at Calvary. I want to say to you, we can trust Him to bear those burdens, but what about those other burdens that we bear? Sometimes, yes, God does remove the burdens, but sometimes He doesn't. With David in this situation with Absalom, he didn't relieve the burden. Yes, Absalom was killed, but all that did for David was exchange one burden for another. I've just been reading through those passages and how David cries out, my son, Absalom, my son. You just hear his heart is being wrenched from within him. So how do you then deal with those things when He doesn't take those burdens away from you? Well, in the same way that Paul dealt with those burdens, when he didn't take the thorn in the flesh away. God said, my grace is sufficient for you. Yes, you've got this burden and you can't bear it, but my grace is sufficient for you. My grace will uphold you and enable you to stand even with the burden still on your shoulders. Because you see, in casting our burden of sin upon Him, He imparts or imputes his righteousness to us, and he takes away that burden of sin and imputes us with his righteousness. But sometimes he leaves the very burdens that you're going through, the rough edges of life, he leaves them on you so that he can use them to impart righteousness to you, to sanctify you more and more. And I want to say this to you. Whatever burden you are bearing now, and you feel, Lord, I don't know how I can bear up under it, I've got good news for you. God has put that burden there for your good, to sanctify you according to his perfect will and purposes. Because God is working all things together for good. All things, including your burdens. He's working them together for good, for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Those whose sins have been borne at Calvary, so that he might conform us to the image of his Son. And so, bear up under that burden as he holds you up to bear up under that burden, knowing that he's working good for you. Amen. Burdens are lifted at Calvary. Let us sing together at Calvary. Let us stand.